What if the Mongol Empire united Europe? Under one Khanate, a sky of iron-gray clouds broods over the rolling plains. The sound of hooves pounds like thunder across the earth, and banners of black horsehair whip violently in the wind. The Mongol horde has come, an ocean of riders stretching further than the eye can see, each arrowhead glinting like a shard of steel under the cold sun. Europe shudders on the brink of annihilation, its kingdoms fractured, its armies scattered, its faith tested in fire. And in that storm rises one question that has haunted historians for centuries. What if the Mongol Empire had not merely raided Europe, but united it, forging all Christendom and its neighbors under a single Khanate? What kind of world would have emerged had the thunder of the steppe echoed through every cathedral and castle? Tonight, we ride into that possibility. The 13th century was an age trembling on the edge of transformation, a time when the fragile world of Europe believed itself safe within its castles, its monasteries, and its patchwork of kingdoms, unaware that far beyond the horizon, a storm was already gathering. From the windswept steppes of Mongolia, a power had arisen that would shake the foundations of the known world. The Mongols, forged in the harshest of climates and hardened by endless conflict, were no longer a loose confederation of nomadic clans. Under the iron hand of Genghis Khan, they had become a weapon, a war machine, unlike anything humanity had ever seen before. Genghis Khan's genius was not only in the battlefield tactics that allowed lightly armed horsemen to shatter the armies of empires. It was in his ability to bind the fractious tribes of the steppe into a single identity, loyal not to kin alone, but to the great Khan himself. His vision stretched beyond valleys and rivers, beyond deserts and mountains. He saw the world itself as a pasture for his horses, and every kingdom that resisted as little more than prey for the hunt. By the time of his death, in 1227, his conquests already stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the edges of Persia. Yet this was not the end. His heirs, bound by a tradition of relentless expansion, carried the storm ever westward. The people of Europe had only faintly heard whispers of this new power. Refugees spoke of cities consumed by fire, of towers collapsing in storms of arrows, of populations slaughtered or driven into slavery. Yet in the courts of Paris, London, and Rome, these tales seemed distant, almost unreal. Europe had its own struggles to contend with. The Holy Roman Empire, sprawling across Central Europe, was less a true empire than a battlefield of squabbling dukes, bishops, and electors. France was attempting to consolidate royal authority after generations of feudal strife. England still reeled from the humiliation of Magna Carta, its monarchy shackled by barons who demanded their rights at sword's edge. Spain remained divided between Christian kings pressing the Reconquista and the shrinking enclaves of Muslim Al-Andalus. Further east, the kingdoms that stood closest to the gathering storm were fractured and vulnerable. Poland was a realm split among competing Piast dukes, often more concerned with their neighbors' intrigues than with distant dangers. Hungary, a rising power on the Carpathian Plain, had centralized strength but was already showing cracks between its king and its restless nobility. Beyond them lay the Rus principalities, Kiev, Novgorod, Vladimir, states bound more by rivalry than by unity, each eager to outmaneuver the other, each blind to the larger peril. To these divided lands came the thunder of hoofbeats. The Mongol armies, under the command of the legendary general Subutai, began to push beyond the familiar boundaries of Asia. Subutai was no ordinary warlord. He was a strategist of terrifying brilliance, a man who could coordinate campaigns thousands of miles apart, who used deception, mobility, and psychological terror as weapons equal to the bow and saber. His campaigns in Persia, the Caucasus, and against the Rus' principalities had already demonstrated the scale of his genius. Entire armies had vanished before him, entire cities reduced to ash, their names remembered only as scars in chronicles. And yet Europe still dreamed that its walls, its castles, its knights in shining mail would be enough. The mounted knight, armored and proud, was the symbol of Christian warfare, the bulwark of Christendom. To the people of France or Hungary, it was unimaginable that men clad in leather, armed with composite bows, could pose a mortal threat to the armored might of Europe. But those who had seen the Mongols knew better. They knew that these were no mere raiders. These were conquerors who fought as one body, who moved with a swiftness that seemed supernatural, who struck without warning and vanished into the horizon before their enemies even understood what had happened. In 1241, the Mongols struck deep into Europe. The Rus's principalities fell like dominoes, their armies crushed on frozen rivers, their cities sacked in flames. Refugees streamed westward, carrying with them tales that sounded more like nightmares than history. In Poland, in Hungary, kings began to muster their levies. The papacy, distracted by its own struggles with emperors and kings, offered little unity or leadership. For Europe, the threat was no longer a rumor. It was at the gates. The storm was gathering, and though Europe had survived Vikings, Saracens, and Magyars in centuries past, this was different. This was not a raid, not a border skirmish, not a clash of rival kingdoms. This was a tide that threatened to sweep away everything in its path, a force that had already annihilated greater empires than any that still stood in the West. The world held its breath, and in the spring of 1241, as the Tumans of Subutai thundered westward into Poland and Hungary, Europe would face its reckoning. The age of the Mongols had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same. But this was only the beginning, for the storm had not yet revealed its full fury. As the year 1241 unfolded, Europe found itself teetering on the edge of a cataclysm it could scarcely comprehend. Rumors had long preceded the Mongols, whispers carried by merchants from the Silk Road, by pilgrims returning from the Holy Land, by refugees stumbling westward with haunted eyes. These were not ordinary tales of raiders or bandits. They spoke of armies that moved with the speed of lightning, of fortresses erased in days, of entire kingdoms reduced to ashes without mercy. But in the great courts of Europe, such accounts often seemed exaggerated, the kind of fantastical stories told by desperate wanderers. The reality was far harsher. In the east, the Mongols had already crushed the Rus's principalities in a series of devastating campaigns. At the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, a coalition of Rus's princes and their steppe allies had been utterly destroyed. European knights, heavily armored and confident in their code of chivalry, had discovered too late that their tactics were useless against an enemy that fought on different terms. Where European warfare revolved around charges of heavy cavalry and clashes of brute force, the Mongols excelled in mobility, deception, and precision. They would feign retreat, drawing knights into pursuit, only to wheel around and encircle them with clouds of arrows. Against such methods, valor and armor became traps rather than advantages. By the 1230s, Subutai, Genghis Khan's most brilliant general, had already envisioned the conquest of Europe as part of a grander plan. Coordinating armies over distances that would terrify even modern commanders, he had shattered kingdoms in the Caucasus, subdued the Kipchaks of the steppe, and laid waste to Volga Bulgaria. He moved like a shadow across the map, leaving nothing but silence in his wake. When the Mongols advanced westward once more, they did so with purpose, precision, and the confidence of an undefeated war machine. Europe, meanwhile, was anything but prepared. The Holy Roman Empire remained a patchwork quilt of duchies and bishoprics, nominally united under an emperor, but fractured by endless rivalries. Frederick II, the emperor himself, was locked in bitter conflict with the papacy, his energies consumed by political battles in Italy, rather than the existential threat gathering in the East. In France, King Louis IX was still consolidating his authority. In England, Henry III faced restive nobles and domestic unrest. Spain's kingdoms were preoccupied with the Reconquista, their gaze fixed southward rather than east. Even when reports reached Europe of Mongol armies devastating the Rus, they did not stir immediate unity. Instead, the warning seemed distant, like thunder heard across a far horizon. Only the kingdoms of Poland and Hungary, lying in the Mongols' path, understood that the storm would not bypass them. King Bela IV of Hungary struggled to rally his nobles, warning that the survival of Christendom might depend on their unity, But many of those nobles saw him as overreaching, more concerned with his own power than with defending the realm. In Poland, Duke Henry the Pious sought to raise levies and gather allies, yet he too faced divisions among feuding dukes and rival families. When the Mongols crossed into Poland in the spring of 1241, they moved with a terrifying swiftness. Small towns fell almost without resistance. Refugees poured westward, bringing with them tales of slaughter that chilled the blood. At Legninga, the Polish forces gathered under Henry the Pious met the Mongols in open battle. What followed was not a clash of equals, but a demonstration of the gulf between two worlds of warfare. The knights charged with valor, their lances lowered, banners fluttering in the wind. But the Mongols refused to stand and be crushed. They yielded ground, showered their pursuers with arrows, split into divisions, and encircled their enemy. The flower of Poland's knighthood was annihilated, its duke slain, its banners trampled in the dust. While Poland reeled from disaster, the main Mongol force under Batu Khan and Subutai pressed into Hungary. King Bela IV gathered what strength he could, bolstered by allies and foreign knights who had come in hopes of stopping the tide. They met at the Battle of Moe, a confrontation that would decide the fate of Central Europe. On the plains of the Sajo River, the Hungarians built a fortified camp, believing their walls and numbers would withstand the nomadic invaders. But Subutai, ever the master strategist, devised a plan to crush them utterly. In the dead of night, Mongol engineers, masters of siegecraft as well as horsemanship, built pontoon bridges across the river, flanking the Hungarian defenses. As dawn broke, the camp was assailed from multiple directions. Arrows rained down in sheets, while catapults hurled incendiary projectiles into the clustered soldiers. Confusion turned to chaos, and chaos turned to massacre. The Hungarian army disintegrated. Thousands were cut down as they fled, and the road to Buda lay open. Europe's illusions were shattered. The knights had not proven invincible. The castles had not stopped the horde. Two kingdoms had been humbled in swift succession, and nothing seemed capable of halting the advance. The terror of the Mongols was no longer a rumor. It was a reality thundering westward. And yet, just as the Mongols seemed poised to drive deeper into the heart of Europe, fate itself intervened. News arrived from Karakorum, the Mongol capital. Ogedei Khan, son of Genghis, had died. The princes of the empire were bound by tradition to return home for the Kurultai, the great council that would elect a new great Khan. The storm that had shattered Poland and Hungary suddenly halted, as if a colossal tide had drawn back from the shores of Christendom. Europe, bloodied and broken, had been granted a reprieve by death and tradition. But it was only a narrow escape. For what if Ogedei had lived a little longer? What if Subutai and Batu Khan had not turned east? What if the Mongols had pressed their advantage, united Europe beneath their banners, and forged an empire stretching from the Pacific to the Atlantic? The question lingers like smoke on the battlefield, and it is here that our story begins to twist. The Mongol invasion of Europe was not the work of chaos, but of cold, deliberate genius. At the heart of this thunderous advance stood two men, bound by blood and loyalty, each playing his part in a drama that stretched across continents. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, carried the mantle of command, the prince whose lineage gave legitimacy to the campaign. Yet behind the throne of the battlefield, it was the mind of Subutai, the dog of war, as the Mongols themselves called him, that shaped every maneuver, every ambush, every devastating blow. Subutai was no ordinary general. Born not into noble lineage, but into a family of humble herders, he had risen by merit alone, proving himself first as a warrior, then as a strategist without equal. He served Genghis Khan directly, earning trust through loyalty, discipline, and a brilliance that redefined the art of war. Unlike the knights of Europe, who gloried in personal valor, Subutai believed in the collective machine of conquest. Every rider, every arrow, every horse was a piece on his vast chessboard, to be sacrificed or preserved not for honor, but for victory. He was the master of coordination, the man who could command armies separated by hundreds of miles and ensure that they struck like the claws of a single beast. By 1241, Subutai had already carved his legend. His campaigns in the Caucasus had broken kingdoms. His victories over the Rus had shown that fortified cities were no refuge. His tactics at Mohi and Legnica had revealed his terrifying mastery of deception, feigned retreats, and multi-pronged assaults. He did not simply win battles. He annihilated enemies so completely that resistance became unthinkable. To face Subutai was to face inevitability itself. Batu Khan, though often overshadowed by his general, was no less crucial. As the grandson of Genghis, his presence gave the campaign its legitimacy. His authority bound the princes of the horde. His lineage ensured loyalty from Tumans that might otherwise have splintered. Together, Batu and Subutai embodied the duality of Mongol power, bloodline and brilliance, heritage and innovation. Their target was not mere plunder. The Mongols had already demonstrated in Persia, in China, in the Islamic world, that their ambition was nothing less than dominion. Subutai's grand strategy for Europe was no raid of opportunity, it was conquest. His plan was to break the kingdoms of Poland and Hungary first, then drive westward into the fractured heart of Christendom. Once there, the Holy Roman Empire, France, even the papacy itself, would face the same fate as Kiev and Baghdad: fire and submission. Europe, in contrast, had no Subutai. Its kings were consumed with quarrels. Its nobles resisted unity at every turn. Even when confronted with annihilation, they fought not as one people, but as squabbling courts, each weighing its own advantage. Pope Gregory XIX, embroiled in his struggle with Emperor Frederick II, sent few calls for unity against the Mongols, and those he did issue went largely unanswered. Where the Mongols had unity, Europe had disunity. Where the Mongols had strategy, Europe had reaction. It was a contest already tilting toward disaster. And yet, as the Tumans prepared to push deeper into the heart of Europe, as Subutai laid out his maps and devised the next steps of conquest, destiny intervened. The sudden death of Ogedei Khan in faraway Karakorum brought everything to a halt. Batu and Subutai, bound by tradition, withdrew their armies. Europe was spared, not by valor or strategy, but by the accident of mortality. But history teeters on fragile threads. What if those threads had not frayed at that moment? What if Ogedei had lived another year, another month, perhaps only another week? What if Batu and Subutai, unburdened by tradition, had driven westward with the same relentless force that had toppled empires greater than France or the Holy Roman Empire? The question lingers like an unloosed arrow flying into the unknown. What if the Mongol storm had never stopped? Imagine, for a moment, that the messenger from Karakorum never arrives. Imagine Ogedei Khan lives a year longer, his heart not yet stilled by wine and age. Batu Khan and Subutai, unbound by the duty to return east for the Kurultai, continue their march into the heart of Europe. The thunder of hooves does not fade across the Hungarian plain. Instead, it grows louder, rolling westward like an endless drumbeat. In this alternate reality, the shattered armies of Poland and Hungary are only the beginning. With their levies destroyed at Legnica and Mohi, resistance collapses across the plains. Buda is reduced to ash. Krakow becomes a smoking ruin. Refugees flee in every direction, their cries echoing through the forests and valleys of Europe. The Danube becomes not a barrier, but a highway for the Mongol Tumans, their riders swarming across bridges, fording rivers, moving with a speed that bewilders every foe. The Holy Roman Empire, already fractured, is caught utterly unprepared. Emperor Frederick II, brilliant but consumed by his endless struggle with the papacy, finds himself unable to summon unity. German princes, jealously guarding their independence, muster only scattered forces. One duchy falls, then another. Castles burn, their stone walls shattered by siege engines dragged across continents. The great cities of the empire, Regensburg, Nuremberg, Mainz, face fire and ruin. The very heart of Central Europe, long thought impregnable, buckles under the weight of the storm. France watches in horror as its eastern neighbors collapse. King Louis XIX, young and pious, rallies what knights he can, but his realm is not yet consolidated. His barons, suspicious and proud, answer slowly, grudgingly, some more eager to protect their own castles than to defend Christendom as a whole. England, across the Channel, breathes nervously, its King Henry III praying that the sea will serve as a shield. But already whispers spread that the Mongols have built fleets on rivers, that nothing is beyond their reach, and through it all, the papacy cries out for a crusade against the new invaders. Yet who will heed the call? The kings of Christendom, divided by politics and distrust, cannot match the unity of the Mongol horde. Where the church preaches holy war, Subutai preaches only inevitability. And his writers, disciplined and relentless, make his sermon truth. The strategies are ruthless, yet elegant. Subutai avoids the Alps, steering his armies across the Danube basin, striking at the soft belly of Europe, where no single power is strong enough to stand alone. He divides his forces, coordinating assaults across hundreds of miles, forcing his enemies to scatter their defenses. The knights of Germany, the levies of Bohemia, the militias of northern Italy, they all meet the same fate as the Hungarians before them. Their charges collapse against feigned retreats, their camps consumed by fire, their armies surrounded by clouds of arrows. By 1242, Europe is no longer the same continent. The Mongols are not a distant terror, but an occupying force, their banners flying over the ruins of cathedrals, their drums echoing in the valleys of the Rhine. The map of Christendom is shattered. From Kiev to Cologne, from Buda to the gates of Paris, the land trembles beneath the hooves of a new master. And here lies the turning point. The Mongols do not stop. In our history, they withdrew, recalled to choose a new great Khan. But in this world, they stay. Batu Khan establishes his camp on the Danube, a throne of felt and iron in the heart of Europe. Subutai rides west, devising the next wave of conquest. France, Italy, perhaps even England, all lie vulnerable. What follows is not a raid, not a temporary occupation, but the birth of something unthinkable. A united Europe under the banner of the Mongol Khanate. The dream of Genghis Khan, to rule from the Pacific to the Atlantic, begins to take shape. The cathedrals of Europe echo not only with Latin prayers, but with the harsh commands of Mongol officers. Tribute flows eastward in rivers of silver and gold. Knights bow their heads not to pope or emperor, but to the distant Great Khan. The storm has not broken. It has settled in, permanent as the mountains, reshaping the destiny of a continent. And as the Mongol grip tightens, the question shifts from conquest to survival. What kind of Europe could exist beneath the shadow of the Khanate? The year is 1242. Smoke drifts above the plains of the Danube like a second sky, the ashes of villages and monasteries mingling with the winter mist. Europe has awakened too late to the truth. The Mongol horde has not turned back. There will be no reprieve, no sudden withdrawal to the east. The storm is here to stay, and its fury now pours westward. From their camp on the Danube, Batu Khan and Subutai unleash wave after wave of Tumans into the heart of Central Europe. Germany bears the first weight. The proud cities of the Holy Roman Empire, their guilds and merchants long accustomed to prosperity, now see fire consume their timbered streets. Regensburg falls after a short siege, its defenders overwhelmed by engines that hurl stones heavier than any knight could lift. Nuremberg resists longer, its walls bristling with crossbowmen, but Subutai brings with him engineers from China and Persia. Towers of wood rise overnight, catapults sling flaming pots of naphtha, and when dawn breaks, the gate splinters under the pounding of rams. The knights who ride out to meet the enemy find only death, encircled by horse archers who dissolve and reform like smoke. By nightfall, the banner of the wolf's tail flies over the city. The empire reels. Emperor Frederick II, trapped in his struggles in Italy, dispatches envoys too late. His princes, divided and jealous, muster their levies piecemeal. They march separately, they die separately. Bavaria's forces are annihilated in the shadow of the Alps. Saxon knights vanish into forests where arrows fall like rain. The Rhine Valley burns, and with it, the economic heart of the empire. France trembles. King Louis XIII, still young, vows to defend Christendom, but he finds himself beset by hesitation. His barons remember the disasters of the Crusades and eye each other's power more than the eastern horizon. When Mongol scouts reach the gates of Metz and Trier, panic spreads like wildfire. Paris braces itself, fortifying its walls, summoning every knight and levy the realm can provide. Yet Subutai, master of war, has no intention of battering his army against the strongest fortress of the West. He moves south instead, toward the wealthy lands of northern Italy. The Lombard cities, rich and proud, believe themselves untouchable behind their stone walls. Milan, Florence, and Bologna have long fought one another for supremacy, but now they face a common terror. Subutai does not attack immediately. He cuts their trade routes, burns their farms, and starves them into submission. Caravans from the east are redirected, their goods flooding Mongol markets. Silk and spices bypass the Mediterranean, flowing instead through the Khan's hands. The wealth of Italy, once the envy of Europe, is strangled at its source. Meanwhile, the papacy raises its voice. Pope Gregory XIX, old and resolute, calls for a crusade unlike any before, not against the Saracens of the Holy Land, but against the invaders of Europe itself. He preaches that the Mongols are not men, but scourges sent by God to test the faithful. Yet his call meets only silence from kings too fractured to unite. What forces are raised march too late, their armies crushed before they can join. At Verona, a coalition of Italian knights is lured into a plain where the Mongols feign retreat. Believing victory near, the knights give chase, only to find themselves encircled. Within hours, their banners lie in the dust, their lords slain or captured. By 1243, Christendom is broken. Hungary lies in ruin, Poland in ashes, Germany crippled, northern Italy in chains. France and England stand isolated, their armies untested against the horde, their people trembling at the stories carried west by desperate refugees. The old order of Europe, Pope and Emperor, knight and castle, lies shattered on the ground. And yet, amid the chaos, whispers spread of strange new accommodations. Some lords, faced with the impossibility of victory, bend the knee to Batu Khan. They offer tribute of gold and grain, promise obedience, even send their daughters as brides to Mongol princes. In return, their lands are spared the torch. For the first time, European nobles kneel not to pope or emperor, but to a Khan seated on the Danube. The Mongols, relentless in war, are pragmatic in rule. Local princes who submit are allowed to govern, their churches left standing, their peasants taxed but alive. Those who resist vanish in fire. The message is clear. Survival lies not in faith or valor, but in obedience. And one by one, the proud lords of Europe begin to bow. What was once Christendom is now something else entirely, a continent unraveling, stitched back together under foreign hands. Knights ride not for glory, but as auxiliaries in the horde. Merchants pay tribute, not in tithes to Rome, but in silver to Karakorum. Cathedrals stand in shadow, their bells drowned by the drums of Mongol overseers. The old world is dying. In its place, a new order begins to rise. A Europe united not by faith or empire, but by the will of the Khan. And as the Mongols tighten their grip, the question grows darker. What happens when conquest turns into governance, when fire gives way to law? By 1244, the world that Europe had known for centuries was gone. The Holy Roman Empire, that sprawling mosaic of duchies and bishoprics, lay shattered, its princes reduced to vassals of Batu Khan. The papacy, once the unchallenged moral authority of Christendom, clung to its seat in Rome, its voice loud in prayer, yet faint in power. France, still unbroken, stood as the last bulwark of the West. England, across the Channel, looked on with dread, its people whispering of fleets the Mongols might one day build to cross the waters. The continent seemed on the verge of collapse. Yet the Mongols, masters not only of destruction, but of pragmatism, now shifted from fire to order. Their war drums still thundered, but alongside them came the scribes and tax collectors, the engineers and governors. Subutai, the warrior who had razed cities, now orchestrated the delicate art of rule. Roads were secured for caravans. Messengers on horseback raced from Paris to Kiev in weeks instead of months. Markets reopened, not under banners of kings, but under the seal of the Khan. Still, conquest was not yet complete. France prepared for its reckoning. King Louis IX, young yet resolute, declared that if Christendom must fall, it would not be without a fight. Paris became a fortress. Stone walls rose higher, moats deepened, bridges fortified. Every church bell rang not only for prayer, but for mustering levies. From Burgundy to Champagne, knights gathered beneath the fleur-de-lis. For the first time since the Mongols entered Europe, a king commanded a united host, tens of thousands strong, ready to meet the storm. Subutai, ever the strategist, studied this resistance with the cold eye of experience. He knew frontal assault would be costly. Instead, he sought to strangle France before crushing it. His tumens swept through Burgundy, cutting the grain routes that fed Paris. Cavalry detachments raided deep into Normandy, burning villages and scattering peasants. The message was clear. No land, no river, no wall could stand beyond the Khan's reach. The confrontation came not at Paris, but on the fields near Reims. There, the French host clashed with the Mongol vanguard in a battle that echoed through the centuries. The knights charged with banners snapping, their lances lowered, their armor glinting in the sun. The impact was thunderous, scattering the first lines of Mongol horsemen. For a moment, hope flared. But it was Subutai's design all along. As the knights pressed forward, believing victory at hand, horns blared from the flanks. Hidden tumens, waiting in the woods, surged forth, cutting into the French rear. Arrows rained down, piercing through mail. Panic spread, discipline faltered, and what had begun as triumph turned into slaughter. By nightfall, the field was silent save for the cries of the wounded, and the banners of the fleur-de-lis trampled into mud. France was broken. King Louis IX barely escaped with his life, retreating toward Paris. His army was gone, his barons dead or captured. The road to the Seine lay open. Subutai, ruthless yet calculating, did not storm the city immediately. Instead, he sent emissaries demanding submission. Paris, starving and terrified, debated in its councils, resist and be destroyed, or bend the knee and live. When the gates finally opened, it was not in glory, but in desperation. The fleur-de-lis was lowered, and above Notre Dame itself, the black banner of the Khan was raised. The fall of Paris sent shockwaves across the continent. England trembled, realizing it now stood alone. The Pope fled Rome, seeking refuge in southern France. Venice and Genoa, those proud maritime republics, offered tribute in gold and ships, preferring commerce under the Khan to annihilation. Even the distant kingdoms of Scandinavia sent envoys, offering furs and silver in exchange for peace. But the Mongols demanded more than treasure. They demanded order. Local rulers swore fealty. Priests prayed for the Khan's health. Knights rode not in crusade, but as auxiliaries of the horde. A continent that had once called itself Christendom now found itself part of something far larger, a machine that stretched from the Yellow Sea to the Atlantic. And yet, beneath the surface of this new order, questions began to stir. Could a faith as old as Europe itself survive under foreign rule? Could a people bound by centuries of rivalry truly accept the authority of a Khan they had never seen? Or would resistance smolder, waiting only for the moment to ignite? The Mongols had conquered Europe in fire and fear. Now they faced a challenge of another kind, to hold it. And the fate of this alternate world would depend not only on battles, but on the fragile balance between sword and law. By 1246, the transformation of Europe was nearly complete. From the rolling plains of Hungary to the bustling markets of Paris, the black banners of the Khan fluttered above towns and cities. Yet conquest was only the beginning. The Mongols now turned their gaze southward, toward the azure waters of the Mediterranean. The riches of Italy beckoned. Venice and Genoa, long the masters of maritime trade, had grown wealthy on the flow of spices, silks, and precious stones from the east. But now those routes passed through Mongol hands. The horde did not merely conquer with fire, it conquered with commerce. Caravans laden with goods from China and Persia poured into Europe through Mongol-controlled corridors, bypassing traditional markets. Suddenly, the great republics of the sea found themselves negotiating not with distant sultans or Byzantine emperors, but with Mongol governors stationed in Milan and Florence. Yet not all were content to bend. In Rome, Pope Innocent IV raised his voice, denouncing the invaders as instruments of Satan. He called for a great holy league, urging the kings of Europe to rise together. But his words fell on deaf ears, for there were no longer kings to command armies of their own. France, Germany, Hungary, each was under Mongol suzerainty. Only England and the Iberian kingdoms remained beyond the horde's grasp, and they hesitated, wary of standing alone. Subutai, now an old man, but still sharp as the steel of his sabers, orchestrated the next great campaign. He understood that to truly master Europe, the Mongols had to dominate the sea. Without fleets, the horde could never threaten England or seize the wealth of the Mediterranean islands. And so, in a remarkable twist of history, Mongol envoys entered into partnership with Venetian shipwrights. The very republic that once battled empires now built galleys for a power greater still. In 1247, the Mongol-Venetian fleet sailed from the Adriatic, its prows cutting through the waves. Sicily was the first to fall. The Norman kingdom, long a crossroads of cultures, was no match for the combined assault of Mongol cavalry sweeping across its countryside and Venetian ships blockading its harbors. Palermo burned, and its rulers were dragged before Batu Khan in chains. From there, the horde's shadow stretched across the islands of the Mediterranean. Sardinia, Corsica, even Crete bowed in tribute. But conquest bred resistance. In the hills of Tuscany, secret bands of guerrillas struck at Mongol patrols. In the forests of Germany, peasants whispered of prophecy that the invaders would one day be driven out by a savior yet unseen. Priests preached in hushed tones, their sermons urging patience, faith, and quiet defiance. Even within the courts of collaborationist lords, whispers of rebellion passed in shadowed halls. The Mongols responded with iron discipline. For every village that harbored rebels, 10 more were burned. For every priest who defied tribute, an abbot was hanged. Yet the resistance was like smoke, impossible to grasp fully, always returning when the hand was lifted. Batu Khan understood the danger, but Subutai, pragmatic as ever, reminded him that fear and tribute would hold longer than fire alone. Meanwhile, England watched with mounting dread. King Henry III fortified the Channel coast, raising beacons and castles along the shore. But he also sent envoys to Batu, offering tribute in exchange for peace. Across the sea in Iberia, the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, still locked in their struggle against Muslim Granada, weighed whether to resist or to align. In this alternate world, the Reconquista faltered, overshadowed by the far greater threat of the East. By 1248, the Mediterranean was no longer a Christian lake. Its islands and coasts bowed to the Khan. Merchants paid taxes not to Rome or Byzantium, but to Mongol-appointed governors. The wealth of the sea flowed eastward, feeding the coffers of Karakorum and reinforcing the unity of an empire that now stretched unbroken from the shores of the Pacific to the waves of the Atlantic. And yet, amid this vast triumph, cracks widened. Could the Mongols truly govern a continent so different from the steppes, with its cathedrals and guilds, its deep traditions of faith and feudal order? Could the unity of fear withstand the weight of centuries-old rivalries and loyalties? For in the shadows of occupied Europe, the seeds of rebellion were already sown, and sooner or later they would grow. By 1250, Europe had become something unrecognizable. Once a continent of feuding kings and quarreling dukes, it now bore the heavy yoke of Mongol dominion. Black banners hung from cathedrals where popes once held sway. Tribute caravans laden with silver and grain moved steadily eastward, flowing like rivers into the coffers of the Khan. Local lords had learned the language of submission, kneeling not to pope or emperor, but to emissaries bearing seals carved with strange steppe symbols. And yet, beneath this surface of obedience, unrest smoldered. The Mongols had conquered swiftly, but their rule pressed against the grain of Europe's traditions. Priests still whispered Latin prayers at altars, invoking saints against the scourge of God. Peasants muttered that no empire could last forever. Even nobles who had bent the knee watched for opportunities to betray their overlords. The first sparks came in Italy. Florence, proud and defiant, rose in rebellion after years of heavy tribute. Its bells rang in defiance, its guilds raised militias, its banners of the lily unfurled once more. For 3 weeks, Florentines fought in the streets, ambushing Mongol patrols, barricading alleys, hurling stones from rooftops. Subutai, weary but unyielding, unleashed a brutal reprisal. Siege engines battered the walls, incendiary bombs rained down, and when the gates finally gave way, the city was drowned in fire. The rebellion ended in ash, its leaders executed in the Piazza della Signoria. The message was clear: resistance would be punished with annihilation. But repression only spread the fire further. In the forests of Bohemia, bands of peasants and fugitive knights formed hidden brotherhoods, striking at supply caravans and vanishing into the night. In the Pyrenees, whispers told of Iberian kings secretly planning a crusade, biding their time until the Mongol grip weakened. In England, monks wrote seditious chronicles, calling on the faithful to prepare for the day of deliverance. The papacy, humbled yet unbroken, became a rallying point. Pope Innocent IV, though stripped of armies, turned to diplomacy. He sent letters to the surviving monarchs of Iberia, to the kings of Scandinavia, even to distant rulers in Africa, urging a coalition against the Khan. These appeals often went unanswered, but the seeds were planted. The Church, denied political power, now wielded moral resistance, binding the oppressed with a vision of eventual salvation. The Mongols, for their part, sought to tighten their grip. Governors were installed in Paris, Milan, and Vienna, each backed by detachments of cavalry. Taxes were ruthlessly collected. Children of noble families were taken east as hostages, raised in Mongol courts to ensure their parents' loyalty. And yet, these very measures deepened resentment. A people who had long fought for faith and fealty would not quietly accept servitude forever. Subutai, old now, understood the danger. He warned Batu Khan that Europe was unlike the steppe or the Islamic lands. Its cities were stubborn, its faith unyielding, its people too many to be ruled by terror alone. But Batu, intoxicated by conquest, dismissed such concerns. He believed fear would suffice, that the thunder of hooves would forever silence rebellion. He was wrong. In 1252, an uprising erupted in Paris itself. Secretly organized by guildsmen and emboldened by whispers of papal blessing, rebels struck at night. Mongol patrols were ambushed, tax collectors slain, and the black banner torn from Notre Dame's spire. For 2 days, the city rose in defiance, echoing with the clang of church bells and the clash of swords. Though the rebellion was crushed swiftly, its symbolism was immense. Paris, once the jewel of the Khanate in the west, had shown that even the proudest conquests could not be secured forever. The embers of rebellion spread. From Tuscany to Saxony, from Catalonia to the Baltic, rumors of revolt circulated like wildfire. Priests preached of divine justice. Nobles plotted in secret councils. Peasants sharpened scythes in hidden barns. The Mongols had united Europe under their banner, but they had also, unwittingly, given it something it had never possessed before: a shared enemy. The Khan's empire stretched vast and unbroken, but in the shadows of its triumph, the seeds of its undoing had already taken root. And soon, the fires of resistance would blaze higher than even the steppe storm could contain. By the mid-1250s, the Mongol domination of Europe seemed absolute. Black banners flew from the Baltic to the Alps, tribute flowed eastward in steady streams, and cities that once sang with church bells now echoed with the beat of steppe drums. Yet history, even in this alternate path, could not be frozen. The very vastness of the Mongol Khanate was its strength and its weakness alike. To conquer had been possible. To hold was another matter entirely. The cracks widened first in the west. The uprising of Paris, though suppressed, had inspired others. In Saxony, whole villages refused to pay tribute, retreating into forests where Mongol cavalry could not easily follow. In Aragon and Castile, kings who once hesitated now saw opportunity. They declared a holy league, their banners emblazoned with crosses, calling for war not just to reclaim Iberia from Muslim Granada, but to liberate Europe itself from Mongol rule. Papal envoys carried the message across mountains and seas, and slowly, pieces of resistance began to align. Batu Khan responded with fury. He summoned more troops from the east. Tumans hardened on the steppes and unleashed them across rebellious provinces. Whole valleys in Germany were burned, Tuscany ravaged, Catalonia assaulted. Yet with every act of terror, the spirit of resistance only deepened. For the first time, fragmented Europe began to resemble something new, a continent united by shared suffering, by common cause against the Khan. Subutai, old and weary, counseled caution. He saw that Europe's cities, though cowed, remained seeds of revolt. He urged consolidation, reduce the burden of tribute, build alliances with nobles, allow the church limited autonomy. But Batu, intoxicated by power, pressed on with harsher measures. He believed sheer terror would extinguish rebellion as it had in Khwarezm and the Rus. Europe, however, was different. Its cities were dense, its networks of trade and faith intertwined, its people too numerous and too stubborn to be broken forever. The Great Reckoning came in 1258. Across Iberia, a coalition of Christian kingdoms, emboldened by papal blessing, rose in arms. Tens of thousands marched northward, not against Muslims as in the Crusades of old, but against the Mongol governors entrenched in southern France. At the same time, in the German forests, rebel bands united under exiled nobles, striking caravans and garrisons with precision. Even in Italy, cities once cowed began to stir again. For the first time, the Mongols faced a Europe that did not scatter but converged. The rebellion spread too widely to be crushed in a single campaign. Tumans rode from one province to the next, suppressing revolts only to find two more flaring elsewhere. Tribute faltered, supply lines strained, and whispers from the east spoke of new troubles, rival princes in Karakorum, challengers to Batu's authority. The climax came at Lyon, where a coalition of Iberian knights, German rebels, and papal levies confronted a Mongol host. The battle was brutal, a clash of steel and arrows, of cavalry charges and feigned retreats. For 2 days the fight raged, the fields littered with corpses, but unlike earlier encounters, the Europeans did not break. Hardened by years of oppression, bound by a desperate unity, they held the line. When night fell, the Mongols withdrew, not annihilated, but checked. For the first time in living memory, the storm had been slowed. News of the battle spread like wildfire. From Scandinavia to Sicily, whispers turned into shouts. The Mongols could be resisted. Cities that once paid tribute now refused. Peasants rose in arms with pitchforks and scythes. Nobles who once bent the knee cast off their oaths. Even the clergy, long cautious, proclaimed openly that God had delivered his people from fear. The Mongol Khanate of Europe was not destroyed in a single moment, but from this point onward, its power unraveled. Batu Khan, aging and embittered, found himself fighting not only rebels in the west, but rivals in the east. The unity that had once made the Mongols unstoppable now frayed under the weight of distance, ambition, and defiance. By 1260, the dream of a Europe united under one Khanate began to fade. What remained was neither the Christendom of old nor the empire Batu had envisioned, but something stranger, a continent scarred by conquest, hardened by rebellion, and slowly discovering its own shared identity. The storm had swept across Europe, reshaping it forever. But as its fury waned, the question lingered. What kind of world would emerge from the ashes? By the closing years of the 13th century, Europe was a land transformed beyond recognition. The Mongol storm had passed, but it had not left silence in its wake. Instead, it reshaped everything it touched. In this alternate timeline, the memory of conquest lingered not as distant legend, but as the lived experience of generations. The fields of Hungary, the ruins of Florence, the scars of Paris, all bore witness to the years when the Khan's shadow stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The political landscape of this Europe was neither the patchwork of feudal lords that had preceded it, nor the enduring Khanate Batu dreamed of. Instead, it was something hybrid, a strange synthesis of East and West. Some regions remained under direct Mongol control, their governors administering tribute, their garrisons patrolling trade routes. Others, though technically independent, still carried the imprint of Mongol law. They levied taxes more efficiently, drilled their armies with greater discipline, and kept their nobles under tighter control, imitating the very structures once imposed upon them. Culturally, too, the legacy was profound. Europe, long insular and wary of outsiders, had been forcibly opened to the wider world. Caravans from Persia and China became familiar sights in Milan and Paris. Spices, once rare, now flavored the stews of peasants. Paper, gunpowder, and new techniques in siegecraft flowed westward faster, altering the trajectory of European technology by decades, perhaps even centuries. The Renaissance that would one day dawn in our history might, in this alternate world, ignite earlier and under stranger stars. Its patrons not only popes and princes, but governors and generals who once rode beneath the banners of the steppe. Religion, however, bore the deepest scars. The Catholic Church, humbled by its failure to defend Christendom, adapted in unexpected ways. Stripped of temporal power, it doubled down on spiritual authority, shaping resistance movements and inspiring unity across fractured peoples. The church that survived Mongol domination emerged leaner, more centralized, and perhaps more radical in its vision. Its sermons no longer thundered about worldly power, but about the eternal struggle between faith and oppression. This defiance gave birth to a Europe that, paradoxically, was more united in spirit than ever before. But what of the Mongols themselves? In this alternate timeline, the dream of a single Khanate stretching across Europe did not endure. Distance, rebellion, and internal strife eroded it. Batu Khan died embattled, and his successors squabbled for dominance. Subutai, long gone by then, was remembered not only as a conqueror, but as the man who had nearly remade the West. The Mongol presence fractured into smaller Khanates, each clinging to its territories. Yet the mark they left behind could never be erased. Europe had been conquered, reshaped, and reborn. And so we arrive at the great paradox of this imagined history. The Mongols united Europe, but not in the way they intended. Their conquest destroyed the old feudal patchwork, broke the power of emperors and popes alike, and forged a sense of shared identity out of suffering. When the horde's grip weakened, Europe did not simply return to what it had been. It emerged with sharper edges, keener unity, and a fire that would one day blaze across oceans and continents. In this world, the age of exploration, the rise of nation-states, perhaps even the revolutions of later centuries, would all carry the imprint of the Khan's shadow. And now we ask, would you wish to live in such a world? A Europe opened to the East centuries earlier, its cities filled with the smoke of rebellion and the scent of spices, its people bound not by kings or popes, but by the memory of conquest? Would you trade the Christendom that was for the hybrid empire that might have been? History, after all, is not only the record of what was, but the echo of what might have been. The Mongol storm nearly broke Europe. In another timeline, it remade it. So what do you think? If the Mongols had united Europe under one Khanate, would the world we know today even exist? Or would everything, from the languages we speak to the nations we call home, be entirely different? Tell us in the comments below what you believe this alternate history would mean. And if you enjoyed this journey into the world that might have been, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more can discover the hidden paths of history's great what-ifs.